In the first episode of You, we are introduced to Joe Goldberg, who works at a bookstore, and he spends most of his time just kind of judging the patrons of the bookstore, who they are, what they do, things like that. But one customer catches his eye one day, and when she comes up to Joe and asks about a particular book, he helps her out, but he is immediately smitten. He starts flirting with her, making small talk, giving her book suggestions, and when she comes up to pay with the book, he makes a mental note that she probably has the cash to buy the book outright, but she wants him to know her name. And you find out that the girl is named Guinevere Beck, but she goes by Beck for short because Guinevere's kind of a weird name. So Joe heads home that night and he passes by a little boy named Paco, who is his next door neighbor, and Paco is sitting outside on the steps reading The Three Musketeers, a book that Joe gave him. And he's outside because his mother is fighting with her alcoholic boyfriend and it's just not a great situation. Joe offers Paco the meatball sandwich that he just got for dinner, saying that he's got Ty in the apartment, and after a little bit of convincing, Paco takes the meatball sandwich, and Joe walks in, but you find out he has no Ty. In fact, he has barely any food. Well, what he does have is Guinevere Beck's name, so he does what any normal person in 2020 does. He immediately gets on social media and starts looking up her information. And since Guinevere Beck doesn't have anything set to private, Joe is quickly able to discern a lot about her. Like the fact that she went to Brown University, she majored in lit, she's in New York City to get another degree, and her addiction to social media, or at least that's what it appears to be, is probably the most unattractive thing about her to Joe. And he's pretty disappointed that an hour after she met him and took a picture of the book and posted it to Instagram, she didn't mention him. But thanks to social media, he's got her address, her work schedule, the fact that she's a TA for a creepy teacher that clearly wants to fuck her. And Joe follows her all the way to a bar that night where she's celebrating a friend's birthday. And she gives the friend an expensive gift that she probably couldn't afford. And when two of the friends get up to leave, her one friend, Peaches, stays behind and asks, how much was that gift? You can't afford that. And Joe hates her friends, but he seems to at least appreciate that there's somebody out there looking out for her. But even after Peaches is trying to help Beck, Joe just cannot stand her. So after the bar, Joe follows her all the way home where the girl doesn't have a set of blinds and she put her bed right next to a window. So it makes it very easy for a stalker to watch her. And it seems like she's about to finally start working on her writing until she gets a text message and this guy shows up out of nowhere. And this guy is the definition of a douchebag hipster. Kind of guy that probably has $600 jeans that are all torn up and has way too much beard product. And when he shows up, Joe quickly goes through his social media account and realizes that this guy's name is Benji. He's a trust fund kid who's had everything handed to him in life. He's a failed model, and now he is the owner of a, get this, artisanal soda company. But at first, Beck isn't too thrilled to see Benji, because while they clearly have a relationship, the last time they saw each other, Benji was caught getting a blowjob from a girl in a party that Beck invited him to. Benji claims that he was drunk, and don't worry, it's not that bad because I didn't even come from it. And after not too much convincing, Benji's able to quickly get in her pants. And because there are no blinds, Joe watches the whole thing go down, all 3 minutes of it. Afterwards, Benji gets up and leaves, and because he didn't really do that good of a job, Beck has to, finish the job for him. And thanks to a stoop across the street, Joe is able to see this, and he decides to join the fun and start touching himself in New York City, one of the most populated cities in America. And nobody noticed. Until, that is, a woman from that building walks out and Joe quickly has to stop. But he's a gentleman, so he helps her out with her bags. So at this point, Joe has had himself a night and decides to pack it in and head home. And when he does, Paco is once again sitting outside of the steps. But his mom and her boyfriend aren't fighting this time. They're just having wild sex. And Paco asks if he has any more book suggestions, to which Joe says, that's a little late. But after hearing the sex continue on and on and on, he says, you know what? Yeah, let's head to the bookstore. Now, the book that Joe wanted to give Paco was sold by the other guy that works at the bookstore, a guy named Ethan. So they head downstairs in the basement to where they keep the rare books. And all of the rare books are kept in something that they call the cage, but really it's a temperature-controlled room to which the books will be held in pristine condition. And Paco starts asking about when he started to work at this bookstore, and he lets him know that Mr. Mooney, the guy who owns the bookstore, hired him when he was a little bit older than Paco is now. But Mr. Mooney was a douchebag, although he did teach Joe everything he knows and started that love of reading. So he starts explaining to Paco about how you take care of the books, and then he gives him Don Quixote to take home. And when they arrive back to the apartment building, the boyfriend, a guy named Ron, yells at Paco for hanging out with strangers, but Paco says he's not a stranger, he's Joe. He says, no, he's a stranger. And then he tells Joe, stay away from my girlfriend's kid. I'm a corrections officer, I know all about you people. And he tries to bully Joe and step to him, but when Joe steps back, Ron backs up a little bit. But Joe's not worried so much about Ron at this point. He's more focused on Beck. And the next day, he calls in a gas leak at her place, and when you call in a gas leak in New York City, they have to investigate. So he shows up at her apartment acting like he knows her and maybe that he's her boyfriend. And when the guy from the gas company says, hey, just let your girlfriend know that there's no gas leak here, he says, yep, will do, and I'll close up. And now he's got access to her place and her laptop. And since she doesn't believe in password protection at all, it's very easy for Joe to discern more information about her. Like the fact that her father died of a drug overdose and Beck found him. And because her computer is connected to her phone, he's also able to see her text messages. And one of the text messages is from Beck shortly after she met him, saying, I can't believe I just met a guy who actually reads in this city. So at this point, Joe thinks that he is destined to be with her. Now, while Joe is going through her stuff, Beck is at school talking to the teacher that she's a TA for. And she owes him 20 pages of poetry, but she's only got one at the moment. And the teacher suggests that maybe the workload's too difficult and you just back up to part-time, but she says, I can't, because if I'm part-time, I don't have housing, so I need to be full-time. I just need an extension. The teacher basically invites her on a date to a gastropub, and even after she brings up his wife, he's not deterred and says, well, if we're sitting and talking about poetry, we might as well do it over a drink. And since Beck doesn't want to risk losing the TA full-time position, she reluctantly agrees to the date. And after the meeting with the teacher, she's a little bit flustered, so she heads home early. And this forces Joe to hide in her shower and pray to God he doesn't get caught. Luckily, he doesn't. He just gets wet after she turns on the shower and then turns it off. But he does learn what she's doing that night, and she's planning on going to an open mic with her friends where she will read some poetry. So with this information, Joe just clears his schedule and heads to that same bar and that same open mic. And her friends don't think it's a great idea to read poetry at an open mic. They think it's just for music purposes. And while they're not wrong, Beck has other plans. And she's also invited Benji, but he hasn't shown up yet when her name is called. So Beck starts reading the poetry and it goes horribly wrong. She starts getting heckled by the crowd, so painful that Joe can't even take it, and he heads home early. So while he's waiting for one of the trains, down the steps stumbles Guinevere Beck. And she's texting Benji, why didn't you come? And she's getting closer and closer to the edge until finally she falls over onto the tracks. Joe goes into Superman mode trying to save her as a homeless guy screams at them, and at the last second, Joe is able to pull her up onto the platform, and now she's on top of him. And it looks like a very romantic moment until she pukes on him. Now, she apologizes profusely for this, but then she realizes, hey, don't I know you? And Joe pretends like he doesn't know her, but then says, oh yeah, that's right, you bought the book. So after they get through the small world type of situation, the two share a cab back to her apartment. They have a conversation about how life would be easier if you were just dumb, to which Joe responds with, yeah, but the world wouldn't know about your poetry. Beck says, how do you know I write poetry? But Joe is pretty quick with his response and says, well, you're a lit major. I figure every lit major writes poetry. Then he starts listing all of his favorite poets, which endears him to her even more. But unfortunately for Joe, when they arrive at her place, Benji is there waiting for her. And after Beck tells Benji about how Joe saved her, she goes to hang out with Benji, but before she does, Joe asks for her information. She can't find her phone, however, and she just figures that she dropped it on the platform. And she also seems hesitant to give her number to a stranger, so she gives him her email. But the reason she can't find her phone is because Joe stole it from her. So now he has even more information on her. And the next day, Joe uses her phone to get Benji's email address and poses as a very popular lifestyle critic. And he emails Benji saying that he wants to try his artisanal soda and possibly use it in a upcoming piece of must-tries. And of course, Benji is over the moon because he loves this guy. But unfortunately for Benji, he doesn't know what this guy looks like. So when he shows up with the soda, he's not meeting this lifestyle critic. He's meeting Joe. And Joe leads him down an alley, which leads to a set of stairs, which leads to a door, which leads to the basement of the bookstore. And when Benji sees what's going on, he gets a little freaked out and says, I don't know if this is for me, but he can't even get the sentence out because Joe hits him with a mallet and he gets knocked out, and that's when Joe puts him in the cage. The next day while he's at work, he's fully expecting Beck to show up because he has her phone and he can see what she's saying. And sure enough, she does. She thanks him again, and she gives him a book with an inscription that has an inside joke about the homeless guy yelling at them. But as soon as she leaves, he goes back down in the basement, and there's Benji saying, look, man, you have the wrong guy. But Joe says, no, I don't. Thank you for watching this recap. If you do not see the next one up in the corner right there on the end screen, don't worry, it'll be up shortly. Please consider following the channel. That'd be cool. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you don't, there's a thumbs down button for a reason.